Difficulty is one of the most discussed aspects of video games, as not only is it a way to communicate about a personal experience, whether that's finding something too hard or too easy or bragging about an accomplishment compared to what others have managed, it's something that's a natural part of a game's design. That interactivity of any kind always carries with it a degree of challenge, meaning if you're talking about gameplay, you're talking about difficulty. And what's more is that people naturally talk about things they don't fully understand, as well as things that frustrate or fail to entertain them. That discussion about design and difficulty isn't just to seek a solution, but to understand oneself in the game in question better than they currently do. But before any of that, the impetus for desiring to understand stems from how helpless people are at noticing when something is off about a design and its accompanying difficulty. That we all have natural sensibilities, instincts developed from experience as well as other human factors that unconsciously process an experience and will trigger a flag if something is off about it. However, just like being sick or disease-stricken, while it's easy to notice something's wrong, being able to understand and locate the ailing cause of the problem is incredibly difficult to manage without the expertise to distinguish. Which means giving a proper solution is even more demanding, as is it a case where the symptoms simply need to be treated, or is there a deeper cause at the root of the ailment that needs to be addressed? Or is there even a problem to begin with? That it's on the side of the player not comprehending or not yet understanding how the game is designed to be played, or not wanting to put in their part to get the most out of an experience that's affecting their perception of it. But maybe that can be blamed on the game, as it's crucial for an experience to get the player into the right mindset and spirit of play so that they aren't seeing issues that don't exist, or even if they do, that they might not be seen as such. But also, all that doesn't mean an experience's design and difficulty should be taken and accepted without a single thought, as that disregards the holism, potential, and conceptual values that a game harbors. But what was delivered may have been incredibly special and affinitive to an individual's tastes and alignments, that maybe it isn't right to disregard such substantial fulfillment that someone got out of an experience even if things could have been better on paper. So all this is to say, it's really no wonder why game difficulty is an unending topic in the world of video games. But hopefully this video will help staunch the unending flow, as getting to the point, since difficulty is such a complicated, varied, and personally steep topic, and because I did plan on making this since completing my Sekiro video, I wanted to get my thoughts out on this facet of game design, so I, myself, can better understand it, and hopefully teach any of you watching something as well. Though I'll admit, the main impetus for making this video was because a few weeks ago, months ago at this point, assuredly months ago at this point, a few of my friends and I had a discussion about how the wire bugs in Monster Hunter Rise, the wirefall recovery in particular, impacted the game's difficulty compared to the rest of the series, at least, well, those are the ones we really know. And regardless of what was said about the system and mechanic, the discussion made me realize that all of us were having a hard time exactly verbalizing and pinpointing what part of a game's difficulty is what we're looking for. Like, what is or is not doing it for us, or what about a given game is appealing or creates an aversion. And what's more is that, just like how everyone has a different love language, we were all speaking a different difficulty language, if you will. Meaning, communicating about this is much more challenging because at a base level, we weren't seeing eye to eye. That in virtue of valuing different kinds of challenges or degrees of challenge, conveying intent is hard because the person or people being argued to will have their own default standpoint that affects their ability to comprehend the conveyor's argument. I know, that's lots to take in there. But in other words, just because something makes sense to you, it might not to someone else. So you need to understand the faculties and reasons for your standpoint, how you got to where you are, why you feel this way, so you can establish somewhere for the other to stand, so they can hopefully begin to see where you are coming from in the discussion. And inversely, you need to be open to such things. This is just discussion and argument 101, but it's good practice to state the obvious. But anyway, what's more something I gleaned from that wire bug discussion is that it's not all about the challenge's design itself. It's not all about how the tangible difficulty is produced. That since games inherently come with some challenge, the design from top to bottom affects this in some way, and that even things like game feel and presentation greatly attribute to a player's perception of a challenge. But then ultimately, It seems to come down to what kind of satisfaction the player receives and how much that matters to them. So the question is, what kind of challenges do we want so we can have fun, be engaged, and feel satisfied? And maybe a challenge doesn't provide all three to the same degree, which is a big part of it too, as video games are all about unique scenarios that ideally exhaust the breadth of the given systems and mechanics and then some to leave the player with no leftover desires, but also to simply provide varied flavor for the equally varied, if not beyond varied taste of its players. That people are going to latch on to these different parts more than others, and that's why we all have different favorite boss fights or levels or weapons or fighters or whatever else. Which then I think the reason you get strong consensus and attachment to certain aspects of games from the player base is because those who align with what the game is providing are inclined to enjoy similar aspects, but I'll get into that more later. In this video proper, I want to talk about a few different topics relating to a game's difficulty, or more accurately, and how I'll be referring to it from here on, its challenge, as I want to clarify and detail aspects on the game design side of a game's challenge, so we can hopefully have more constructive discussions and clarity of thought, which is what I'm here for, when it comes to this familiar, ever-present, yet convoluted subject. But then more importantly, I want to discuss how different players naturally value certain kinds of challenges over other kinds, and that satisfaction and accomplishment are different for everyone. And I'll say this now because this is the bottom line. Discussing difficulty is ironically exceedingly difficult. It's very hard. So I'll do my best to clearly paint my points, and I ask that you try not to fixate on a specific example or reference point for when you think of difficulty and challenge, as this is an abstract topic that applies to more than what may initially come to mind. But at the very least, I hope what I have to say is something that'll clear up after digestion and internalization, and that, like with any of my discussion or lecture videos, that whatever I have to say will at least elicit some better understanding of yourself and this medium we all love. So, before getting into principles of design difficulty, there's two major pillars of game design, two important design considerations I need mention that'll lay out the foundation of what's to be discussed in this video, and that these are crucial to understand when designing a game. First is the flow state chart. If you watched my Sekiro critique, then this will look familiar. This chart demonstrates that the player's level of skill in the given challenge should ideally be in mostly equal portions to maintain the player within the flow channel, where flow is achieved, where the player is engaged with the content and not seeing any problems. Low skill and high challenge elicits anxiety, or often more so, frustration. High skill, low challenge, boredom, and disengagement. I find that skill is also a concept that's so ubiquitous and ingrained in us that you might actually have a hard time putting what it is into words, even though you know it so well, so I'll define that now. Skill is a measure of comprehension and execution developed through experience, heightened by talent, and restricted by aptitude. An individual's understanding and capability to understand a given subject and then act upon that know-how is skill. So if you go to play a game you never have and you don't know what the rules of play are or what the buttons do, you would have low skill. Not necessarily low potential, just low skill. But the moment you're told what a certain button does or how a system works, your skill goes up on principle of knowing more than you did. I bring up the flow state chart because this is one way to measure and depict the foundation of games. That games are made up of content and interactivity. Content inherently harbors a degree of challenge, and interactivity means skill, as it involves doing something. So understanding these two and how they play off of each other is crucial to being able to skillfully design a game. Personally, I don't think a straight difficulty curve, well, line in that case, is the ideal base to aim for. I believe that a staircasing line whose step edges peak into the upper edge of the flow state or jutting slightly out of the top of it is a more ideal goal. But normalizing an experience can create something uninspired and unmemorable, so some high highs and low lows are far from a bad thing. It's just that the line shouldn't coast for a lengthy period of time outside the flow channel. That's when you're getting the egregious design and difficulty balance. And just so you know, this chart can be applied to an entire game or within a single minute of gameplay and anywhere in between. It could be even a single second. You could even write this down or use this to measure how easy it is to press a button. Then we have Bartle's taxonomy of player types, which defines 4 major player types based on what motivates a player to play a game, that what about a game is fulfilling them, with the 4 types being socializers, explorers, achievers, and killers. This kind of categorization can be fun for people, as this taxonomy is very similar to personality types, that you could take a test similar to a Myers-Briggs test to find out which type of gamer you are, which can give someone a more concrete understanding of themselves as well as what others may be like or what they're into. But unlike the Myers-Briggs personality types that work with a 2-sided spectrum in each of its 4 categories, that you're either this or that, introverted or extroverted, this taxonomy of player types is fittingly better likened to a stat allocation system, that while there's likely one player type a person favors over the other 3, if say we had 100 points to distribute across the categories, every category would be filled to a substantial degree. We all have a different build, so to say, which really, we do. And because of such reasons, I do take some issue with how this system is typically defined and exemplified, as the commonly found definitions often read as if a player of this type is only drawn and motivated by whatever the type is defined by, which comes off as naive, unrealistic, and stringent to me, as most players are not going to exhibit such extreme favoritism towards a single type. I especially take issue with the explorer and achiever definitions, as it paints them as the intrinsic and extrinsic side of a game's interactive fulfillment, respectively, which I don't agree with, as achievement can be sought after and obtained without any reward or denoting merit, and exploration can, and often is, done so because of incentive rather than for the sake of it. So I find it more accurate to call these 4 categories the aspects of a player, or player aspects, rather than player types, as an individual harbors a unique mix of these, rather than being wholly dictated by a single one, and also because I think it makes more sense to define what makes up a player first and to sort them into groups later, rather than the other way around. Though I do still find it easier to refer to these aspects as player types, since it's easier to latch onto as a human, that it's more concrete and personal that way, meaning you'll still hear me refer to them as types. I just wanted to clarify that bit about them first. Anyway, all this is to say, with the definitions to follow, I'll be taking some considerable liberties compared to what you may know. So, in finer detail, the 4 player types and aspects are: socialization and socializers. I don't think this category needs much of an explanation, but this is playing a game to receive social fulfillment. This could mean playing MMOs, team-based games, social simulators, that game that's cursed the word suspicious for at least the next 5 years, or simply whatever's popular. So people that favor this type are drawn to a game because they can be involved with others. Exploration and explorers. While typically defined as players looking to take things at their own pace and immerse themselves in a world, I think it's better to define this as gaining fulfillment out of a game's adventure qualities, which encompasses and supersedes the idea of an explorer, while also carrying narrative fulfillment and presentational fulfillment along with it. Adventure and open world games, as well as story-focused and cinematic games, are some examples of what adventurer explorer players are drawn to. So while the socializer and explorer side of the 4 aspects and types are focused on the spiritual, thematic, and connectivity elements that a game provides, the other 2 types of achievers and killers latch onto the gameplay side of a game, that the technical and meritorious elements are what matter to these players. Achievement and achievers, or as I've always known this aspect and type as, challenge and challengers. This is gaining fulfillment from overcoming something or bettering oneself, whether that's someone completing a ridiculous challenge just to say they did it, or wanting to feel themselves improve. These players are looking to be pushed and for something to excite and engage them in an intense manner. I find challenge and challenger to be a more appropriate name than achiever, as while it's not much different, tangible achievement and reward is not a necessity for someone looking for a challenge, even if such guidelines and goals are often defining aspects in the kinds of games these players like. Arcade-style games, action-focused games, tactics or turn-based games, which may sound surprising, puzzle games, and rhythm games are some examples of what this player type gravitates towards. Then lastly are killers, which are really just competitive players that aren't concerned with sportsmanship and are all about feeling superior to another. So while traditionally the killer type is defined as those who gain fulfillment out of imposing themselves and feeling superior compared to other players, and that is a facet of this aspect, I think it's more accurate to say this is the aspect and type of competition and competitors, which is not only more accurate, but has a less negative tone towards this type and more of a non-biased one. Anything competitively steeped like fighting games or shooters are where you'll find these savages. Personally, I find myself to be primarily a challenger, followed by explorer, with socializer and killer about the same. With socializer beating out killer slightly, though I think it depends on the context, which it always will depend on the context. Now, I mention these because on the developer side, understanding these player types can help determine what kind of experience they want to aim for and or the types of players they're looking to attract with the experience, with the game. And then on the player side, they'll ideally be able to better identify whether or not an experience is designed with their player type in mind, and potentially even so they can better understand what parts and aspects of an experience they do or do not align with and why, so that they aren't overly critical of something with intent not aimed at them, that they can better understand the holism and core direction of an experience and better judge or critique it accordingly. Like in the case of this video's discussion, if something's very challenging, in whatever sense it may be, a player that falls into the Explorer Socializer realm would do well to understand that they'll only frustrate themselves if they continue playing. But it all, of course, does depend on the person in the given scenario, but that's the general idea when it comes to player types. I mentioned these two aspects of game theory and design because this is where a game's challenge is being founded from. What kind of play does the game facilitate? Meaning, what kind of player is it likely to resonate with, and is the game's challenge being designed and balanced how it's desired to with the player's skill in mind? And also, these are just useful to know if you're going to be discussing games, especially if you're talking about games like Monster Hunter or Dark Souls that facilitate all of these player types to a substantial degree. There are many reasons those are popular games, and appealing to so many types of players is certainly a major factor. So, with that laid out, let's get into talking about different ways difficulty can be created and affected within a game. I know it's been a bit of a long, I don't want to say an intro, this has all been content, I think this has all been pretty good, but this is finally getting into the juicy shit. First and most importantly is something that exists at all levels of design and is one of, if not the ultimate factor regarding a game's challenge, that I want you to keep in mind when I discuss all that's to come, and when you discuss anything for forever, and that is balance. The fine-tuning and property alteration of the systems and mechanics with target levels of challenge in mind. But more so, balance is the act of making the unique parts of a game work together where they might not otherwise. That it's taking a concept and making it work with another. And while balance is something that affects every inch of the game design, and thus its degree of challenge for the player, on the user end in many games, it takes a particularly noticeable form in that of difficulty options or modes that provide a unique designation and tuning of the game's core rules, mechanics, and systems. And that often this is enough or at least serviceable to provide varied or desired experiences for the likely varied skill tiers and capabilities of its users, which just goes to show how important metric and rule tuning can be. There are countless instances of this, but the selection of difficulties in the Halo games are a simple, straightforward, and well-known case of this kind of challenge design practice. Now bear with me for a moment on this next one. It's incredibly nebulous, but it'll clear up once I get to the examples. I just need to establish it first. If we consider balance to be the execution side of a game's challenge, then there must be a conceptual side as well, that before a mechanic or system can be balanced, it needs to be designed and structured based on an idea. That while the design of a mechanic or system itself may be tangible, it is dependent on a concept's intent and desire. Just like how balance is dependent and bound by what form such an idea takes. Meaning that while a design can take an infinite number of forms from an idea, its concept is still the ruling factor. Now what this means for a game's challenge is that it's heavily dependent on how well the different concepts sync up with each other, that based on how something is desired and intended to work regardless of balance, it may just be easier or harder on virtue of what it is, and may be the cause for a disparity in the game's balance. And I'll refer to this as a conceptual asynchrony. The idiom of a square peg in a round hole is often what I liken this aspect of challenge design to, that difficulty is increased because of the asynchronous shapes of the two objects. And this same concept can be applied on the directional front of games as well, that conceptual asynchronies can be rooted in a lack of unified or incoherent direction. Fighting games are an excellent example of what I'm talking about here, as one of the greatest challenges in fighting games, apart from the technical aspect and skill level of the opponent, are a fighter's matchups. And that's really what a conceptual asynchrony is. How well one thing matches up to another. That a character is better or worse at handling another based on their conceptual designs. Like for example in Smash Ultimate, fighters that conceptually carry something about them that affords them disjointed and wide-reaching attacks, like swords, do well against smaller characters like Pikachu or Game & Watch because they can hit them easier than other fighters and keep them at bay safely. Whereas a character like Captain Falcon, who is clearly intended and designed as a technical brawler that has tight moves that have trouble reaching the ground, must put in a lot of work and make riskier plays to deal with these small-ass annoying characters that are directed to be that way, and come from other media that's already established, so it's not like they can change much. Conceptual, you see? Though in Smash there is a clever normalization of the fighter sizes, it's just not as noticeable because of the character's proportions. And that right there, that's balance. Now, conceptual asynchronies can come in unexpected and probably unintended forms as well, which I'd wager most discussion involving bullshit or unbalanced difficulty comes from these kinds of asynchronies. I've been replaying through Dark Souls 3 with my friends, and I've been using spear weapons for the first time in the series, and I've noticed an unexpected challenge comes with using these weapons, as areas are frequently close quarters and filled with static set dressing that enemies like standing near and getting pushed into by the necessary amount of stabs required from a spear to kill, and that since my weapon's got decent reach and a surprisingly wide hitbox, half the time I'm getting hit is because of clicking off a wall and getting massacred during the extended recovery animation. So odd as it is to say, using a spear in DS3, and probably the other games as well, is more challenging than a lot of other weapons because of how the levels and dungeons are concepted to be designed, as well as how contacting a weapon with the environment is desired to work. Though it is funny, and by funny I mean awful for me, how non-polearm weapons are balanced with this in mind and deflect significantly less knowing that their conceptual design means they'll be swinging horizontally all the time. But something to note here is that difficulty produced from an unintended asynchrony is harder to pin down, as this could just be a case where the concept wasn't balanced properly, and that the concepts themselves are fine. But even then, most games worth talking about usually have sufficient balance and tuning of its designs so that conceptual asynchronies aren't noticed, which is good and bad, as not seeing them makes for a better user experience. However, if there is a pathological issue and the user can't identify it at a surface level because of how the balance buries it, then that may cause some serious frustration. The example I have related to that is how the weapons and monsters in Monster Hunter have a conflict of interest in some cases. Obviously, they make it work. I do like those games. But when you have monsters that have action privilege, fast recovery, and are generally unstoppable, and then hunters with weapons that are heavily combo and flowchart oriented, the two sides aren't in harmony. But like I said, they make it work. So it's hard to dig up and discern if it's a true problem, and if anything, even if I did, the ground would always be faulty on virtue of them pulling it off as well as they do. Now following that example in line of thought, there is something to be said about challenge born from a directional asynchrony, that part of a game's challenge is coming from two sides pulling in different directions. The Monster Hunter example can apply to this, that while once again they make it work, I do believe the Hunter capability direction and monster direction are tugging in different directions, even if ultimately unified, and that a fair bit of the game's challenge comes from this. I'm not going to get much more into this as Monster Hunter is still a series I'm ruminating on and digesting. Plus, like I said earlier, it appeals to a lot of people for many reasons, so tackling it in a paragraph or two is a fool's errand. This is not the place for that. But I do find the series fascinating for being able to walk the blurry line between a setup tool-oriented hunting style game and a style all over the monster character action focused game, because you think they'd focus designing the game for one or the other, that either weapons are more situational and tool-like so the focus is on hunting the monster, or that the monsters are designed and tuned in favor of the weapons, which would probably mean more frequent damage openings, but somehow they have their cake and eat it too. Now, something important to note before moving on, while it may sound like a bad thing in a game's design to have conceptual asynchronies, if a design is too clean and vetted, it can make for a forgettable, stringent experience. And that if anything, variety and inherent unfairness is a crucial element in designing the features and aspects of a game, as it keeps the experience fresh by providing new matchups to learn, and it gives the different players something to latch onto as something they care about. Unfairness is good. You just have to balance it right. And that's really what game design is. It's just that unbalanceable concepts, or concepts that are too asynchronous, can be unhealthy to a game's design. I wanted to spend significant time on this aspect of challenge because this is the most important one to understand and will hopefully help you all the most when discussing difficulty and challenge from now on. But we are far from done. Let's move into listing concrete types of challenge design, aspects that can be applied and tuned to alter a game's challenge. And thankfully, these will be a lot simpler, a lot easier, ironically, to talk about, starting with a fun one. Randomness, or alia as it's known in regard to the way to create gamification, is something found throughout games of all kinds for such mentioned reasons. And when it comes to difficulty, any element's degree of randomness has a direct influence on the challenge, as it simply makes for factors that are out of the player's control, usually for better and worse. The trade-off, though, is that it's an exciting element to include in games due to keeping things varied and unpredictable, and because humans are helpless to the thrill of gambling, as well as because it makes for less severe loss aversion, that players won't take things too hard if randomness can be blamed, though that can just as likely lead to frustration given the player and context. Like in a competition played between high-skilled competitors, it's reasonable for them to want as much in their control as possible when money's on the line. Next is conveyance. This is probably the most important aspect of game design when actually creating the game, as this is informing the player of the game's rules. This is giving them the information they need to be able to play the game. And I'm not just talking tutorials and literal rule sets. This means providing applicable, necessary information, like resource values, platform visibility, attack telegraphs that hopefully have hitboxes that match what the player is seeing, and an infinite number of other things. The scenario I often give my friends when bringing this up is that it would be exceedingly difficult to play Monopoly blindfolded, or if the fake money wasn't present. Double fake money, since real money's also fake. But anyway, the point here is that the amount of information provided to the player greatly affects the challenge, as information equals skill, or at the very least, it increases a player's potential to increase their skill. However, too much info that takes on the form of hand-holding can be dangerous, as this can throw the player into the bored area of the flow state chart and arguably diminish the game aspect of the game, with the opposite extreme being too little information that produces a heavily trial and error based game design and can make the player overly frustrated and anxious. However, as always, as I'll keep saying, it all depends on what the game's intent is. It all depends on the context. Technical demand. The physical and dexterous demand required to play a game, or at least operate it sufficiently. A relatively high technical skill floor with a high skill ceiling results in a greater challenge than otherwise. Fighting games and shooters are good examples of this, as fighting games operate with tight inputs and fractional second operations, while shooters are a test of hand-eye coordination, with both being highly dependent on a player's reaction times and split-second decision-making. That's more instinctual than it is conscious most of the time. Inversely, designs that are highly assistive, automatic, and give large windows to react and process info are less challenging. So, for example, a game that snaps the player character to an enemy when attacking is much easier than a game where the attack plays out based on the current positioning and facing direction of the controlled character, as the latter requires spacing and positioning judgment to connect the actions, meaning there's more room for error, thus more challenge. And even within games that are generally technically demanding, there's a range of this across all the actions present, that at a finer level certain actions, abilities, and characters are more technically demanding than others. Next we have complexity. If technical demand is the physical side of a given skill, comprehending something's complexity is the other, probably more important side. Pretty simply, the more complex something is, the more challenging it will be to handle, overcome, or learn on virtue of needing to comprehend and track more factors than otherwise. In other words, depth affects challenge. Learnability. This is something of a combination of complexity and conveyance, that the harder something is to learn, as well as how difficult it is to teach, will affect the challenge of a game. But even before that, learnability is a measure of how well the game manages to facilitate a learning environment for the player to understand what they need to know. This is typically dependent on tutorialization and consistent conveyance. But if something's hard to learn, then it's hard to learn. Like if you're putting math of any kind in a game, just forget it for people. Just forget it. I don't think it's that they're incapable of doing math. I think people just don't want to do math a lot of times. Unless it's a game about doing math. Then obviously that's the game itself. Anyway, those are the major means of producing difficulty, as they cover a lot of the top level principles without getting too detailed. But before moving on, to make sure I get all my thoughts out and to give some more examples to help clarify any fuzzy thoughts on what I've been discussing, I'm gonna list some focused game elements that are substantial or notable that affect a game's challenge, and some that don't actually, because I need a place to mention them. I'm gonna go fast here, but I'm gonna name what I'm talking about first. Endurance demand. That longer encounters or moments of attrition increase something's challenge as the mind and body wears down over time as well as operates inconsistently. Harshness of loss conditions, meaning how difficult is it to reach a fail state. This is a crucial element to a challenge, as this defines the bounds of it. This is probably the main reason Dark Souls is considered hard, as few mistakes are permitted without healing, and healing itself is a limited resource. So that mixed with a checkpoint layout that creates a significant degree of endurance demand greatly attributes to Dark Souls' challenge. Convenience. A minor factor, but in theory, extra steps make something more complex and lengthier to accomplish than otherwise. Conveniences may also enable bad habits in the player or deter their skill, but quality of life is so nice to have. Timing windows and game speed, the degree at which the game tests physical reactive capabilities and in-the-moment decision-making of the player. Card counting, which is a facet of complexity. The more there is to consider and account for, the harder something is. Tactics and card games are great examples of this. Input execution. Not just the physical technique and motions, but timing as well, as input buffers play a huge role in a game's flow, as the ease or difficulty of translating desired actions from one's mind into the game heavily affects the overall challenge. Bringing back up Dark Souls, this is a series with a noticeably egregious input buffer that adds significantly to the challenge by demanding more deliberate inputs. However, it is a bit dirty, as buffered inputs often persist through actions that stun or shift the flow of combat, that actions determined from a previous moment are forced to occur in the new situation. Kinda nasty, can be bypassed though. Now here's something a dev can't design for outside of skill-based matchmaking, and that is the skill of a player-opponent. It's one of the most common challenges we experience, and it turns out good players are harder to fight than otherwise. Another one out of the devs' hands is, well, the player. A player can make something harder on themselves, intentionally or not, by simply having a natural aversion to the ways challenge is being produced, or they're just unwilling to cooperate with what's being presented. So I think the game should do what it can without going overboard to get the player in the right mindset. And maybe they just need time to warm up and acclimate to something unfamiliar. I know I typically do, which can often lead to an acquired taste, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'll finish this part out by discussing the two strange factors I mentioned towards the beginning that impact a game's perceived challenge, and those are game feel and presentation, kind of two sides of the same coin. Now, game feel is certainly steeped in mechanical and systematic qualities, and because of such reasons, a desired game feel could be the root as to why something is as difficult as it is, which in turn can attribute to a feeling of difficulty from the presentation. This is probably difficult to conceptualize, but in the case of that Monster Hunter wire bug discussion, one of the main points was that the wire bugs made the game much easier, as it can often be used to bypass the heavy knockdown system and wake-up dynamic that's a staple of the series. Which is true, as being able to reposition and heal while the monster is still attacking creates a longer window to safely recover. However, endgame monsters seem to be designed and balanced with this powerful mechanic in mind, so the player needs to be more conscious when using it against such monsters. But more importantly, while I've certainly made plenty of stupid decisions on Wake Up and World, as you can see here with this goddamn monkey, recovering safely isn't terribly difficult, even if wearisome and arduous. Which, getting to the point here, regardless of which dynamic presents a greater challenge, the knockdown system, because it forces and presents a moment of helplessness on the player, absolutely feels more oppressive, and that even if it isn't a substantially more challenging dynamic compared to Wirefall Recovery, its presentation and impact on the player's game feel is significant to the perceived degree of challenge, which, hey, that could translate into considerable pressure and stress, thus real challenge. Placebo's a hell of a drug, and games are all about fooling the player and instilling a desired emotion in them. Now, while that knockdown dynamic is precious to plenty, personally, with my Monster Hunter experiences, all 2 of them, I'm going to play Generations Ultimate soon, I'm more attracted to the hunter capability side of the game and not so much the oppressive monster aspect. Well, I'm probably somewhere in the middle, as I just want a game that's capital M monster and capital H hunter, not all caps one and all lowercase the other. And a big part of that capitalization allegory is what kind of challenge the game is delivering, as well as what kind of satisfaction the player is looking for. And this is once again all contextual, because any specific game or genre is going to align differently with the player, so even if something is egregious to them in one context, it might not be in another. This is tough to put into a broad definition, so let me give an anecdotal example with what I mean when I'm talking about satisfaction in players liking different kinds of challenges. Personally, I'm someone who's incredibly intrinsically focused, that winning and losing doesn't matter to me nearly as much as knowing I did well or improved in some fashion, which is not to say that winning or losing does not affect my degree of satisfaction, I just don't put as much stock in it as I'm focused on myself. And when it comes to challenges in games, that means I'm looking for intense, engaging, and in-the-moment challenge rather than something that's going to fail-state me over and over until I surmount it. Because even if I would feel somewhat fulfilled after an arduous accomplishment, if I didn't accomplish it through satisfying means, the victory likely wouldn't mean as much for me. In fact, an ideal challenge for me, or at least what I think is an ideal challenge for me, is a scenario where I can feel myself improving and time slowing down as it gets down to the end of the wire, that I'm just scraping by with my victory. You know, like the end of a sports anime match. A little romanticized, but hey, I'm all about the special things that are very rare. And this isn't to say attempt count and or time investment that creates the possibility of enormous catharsis isn't a factor to how I feel satisfaction. In fact, I think time investment is a crucial factor to create player attachment on the principle of mere exposure, and maybe Stockholm Syndrome, but such investment just doesn't weigh as heavily as other means of challenging and satisfying me do. Meanwhile, I have a lifelong friend who has always been very win and goal focused, that the completion and satisfaction of an unfair struggle matters much to him, that the win means a lot. We talk about the Dark Souls series often, him and I, and all my friends, which, when I say Dark Souls, I really mean the bosses, because they're probably one of the most standout factors. Obviously, there's a lot more to it, but in the case of Dark Souls 3, I personally put Lorien and Lothric at the top of my boss fight list because I love everything about that fight. And obviously there's more to loving a boss fight than its challenge. However, I had a great personal experience with the fight, as the awe and admiration of the glorious presentation mixed perfectly with the unique style of the fight that I did have trouble with. It was a substantial threat to me, which made for one of the most engaging encounters I've ever experienced in a game. But that said, strictly speaking of the fight's difficulty, it's certainly not the hardest in the game, so it doesn't rank high on my friend's list because of this. Not to say he doesn't like it, just that it doesn't rank as high as some of the harder ones. I'd liken this dichotomy of challenge affinities between my friend and I to the moral theory of consequentialism versus non-consequentialism. That is, the question of whether or not the ends justify the means. If you don't know or are not sure what I'm talking about, go watch Code Geass. That's the first piece of media I noticed this moral concept in, and I think it does a good job at depicting it while also being highly engaging, unique, and entertaining. But all this is to say, while I'd qualify my friend and I as both primarily the challenger player type, I'm a challenger explorer, meaning I'm looking for some spectacle and to admire what's being delivered all around while staying engaged by threatening means in the scenario, whereas my homie is a challenger killer, meaning he is looking to prove something and feel he overcame something arduous. And there's nothing wrong with either of those. It's just to show that people are looking for different things in an experience, and that these player types are a good indication of what a player is likely to care about. But as said, there's so much to every individual, and games are complicated and deep, so it's certainly a hard subject to pin down an exact science on. But still, if you consider all I've mentioned here and then some, as well as use it clearly to converse with others, you'll probably have less painful arguments than otherwise. I think all that sounds pretty good. Hopefully it's been clear, or that you'll at least come to understand what I'm trying to convey, or that you'll find I'm full of it and believe I'm completely off the mark and this helped you realize what moral side of difficulty design you stand on, and that my stances and lecture style somehow awakened this, which I can only hope happened because that would be pretty cool that I have that effect on people. Anyway, let's round out this video by finally talking about artificial difficulty, now that a baseline understanding of challenge design and player type satisfaction has been established. And ironically, I don't find it difficult to define artificial difficulty, though that may be just because I've been thinking about this topic for a very, very long time. When did Dark Souls 2 come out? Artificial difficulty is an inflated challenge that disregards what the core game design affords in favor of an unbalanced or extreme situation that the player has few feasible means of handling, often resulting in gameplay exploitation or savage amounts of trial and error to complete. Or it can be said this is difficulty designed to fail the player rather than challenge them. Or it's a design that doesn't play by its own rules and is steeped in sadistic or vicious intent. I think designing challenge scenarios in a game inherently comes with a bit of sadistic intent from the developers. Like, they are making this game to satisfy themselves at many levels, so having some fun with it on their end makes a lot of sense. And my friends and I have been seeing this while playing through Dark Souls 3, as any time some seemingly evil bullshit comes up, we just simply comment with, "They thought it would be funny." Because, well, they did think it would be funny. And it definitely is at times when looking at it through that lens. But even so, we don't get horribly frustrated with it because we know they're good at what they do. It's just that when something comes off as incompetent or vicious in the design, rather than clever or cheeky, that it becomes artificially difficult. And while ironic, I think artificial is a great name for this concept, as sufficient design is something that a player won't notice or feel put off by, that it feels appropriate and natural to the player based on the big picture that they're understanding without realizing, whereas the poor design of artificial difficulty is ironically exposing the game for what it is: fake. In game design, this is called breaking a player's illusory attitude, that a player is realizing they're playing a game, and more so, that they're seeing the faults in it, which may dissuade them from continuing to play, and as a game designer, as a developer, you do not want this. Discussion around Dark Souls 2 propagated this concept for a good reason. Hell, I think it was coined because of this game, I don't exactly remember though. But DS2 is incredibly imbalanced and cheap, that it's clearly out to kill the player rather than challenge them, as the game features a slow, clunky, recovery frame-ridden unit as the playable character, and the game space is populated with an overabundance of enemies that are not balanced with this player character in mind, and also aggro from half a level away for some stupid fucking reason. And that many scenarios are tedious situations with no reasonable way to handle them, despite the broad RPG and build focus the game's core design features. You know, that thing Dark Souls is about, being able to tackle the world however you want while role-playing a build? So instead of providing content that could be handled by any desired means with moderate shift in difficulty based on the conceptual asynchronies of the player's build and the opposing content, that cheese, leashing, and other absurd and boring means are the feasible, reasonable ways to get through the awful content. It's always been absurd to me that anyone can like this game. However, it makes a lot of sense for the killer and killer challenger player types to be the primary ones to latch onto this game because of its supposed high-quality PvP, and because overcoming something absurd that many others will not produces bragging rights and satisfaction knowing they stand above another, and that the core qualities and dynamics of the game itself are secondary to such fulfillment. So while I'm disgusted by this game, I do understand it is ultimately not for me. However, it is a sequel to Dark Souls, and to experience something so disappointing in the same name that defiles and disregards what made its predecessor so special, I cannot help but revile it. There's probably more to it than that, as I try not to remember much about DS2, but those are the sins that I'll never forgive or forget. In discussion like this, I think about how Dark Souls 2 would be playable, even somewhat enjoyable, probably not, if a Bloodborne hunter was the playable character instead. Like, with all his capabilities, weapons, and tuning dropped right into Dark Souls 2, you'd be able to handle the enemies so well, it would be pretty fucking satisfying. Now, it's not like there shouldn't ever be absurdly difficult moments in a game. I think I've mentioned this before. But the rarity of them in placement is crucial, as this makes them more special. Like, for example, Bloodborne has two notable scenarios that teeter on unreasonably difficult and demand the most careful, precise play and timing compared to anything else in the game. And these are the encounters with the two sharkmen in the well in the fishing hamlet to get the Rockio, and the gauntlet against the three winter lanterns on the bridge in the Mensis Nightmare. These are tough, as the Sharkmen are just absurd with their attack durations, hitboxes, timings, and parry windows, as they bypass much of what defensive play you can do in Bloodborne, making them easily the toughest enemy in the game. And then the Winter Lantern Gauntlet requires the player to either somehow tank through the constant frenzy and not get grabbed, or what was likely more intentional, as this is what everyone I know that made it through this challenge did, is parry the grab and avoid the brain pop during the riposte animation 3 times in a row. Hell, 4. There's stuff even after the first 3 that you have to deal with. Very challenging, but they're optional scenarios and give a substantial reward, and are satisfying as it feels good to get past some bullshit every now and then. It's just that when a game is only stuff like this, it's torture, not entertainment, nor contest. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and until next time.